Yeah, I did all the YouTube stuff. All right, so in theory, can you hear me through the mic? It's on? Can you hear me through the mic? It says it's on. Oh, there we go. See, that one wasn't on me. All righty. Oh, I'm on. Hey, look at that. We turned it on. Good. All right. Well, welcome. As my slides go crazy, we're going to pick up where we left off on textual criticism. So we're on part 2. If you remember, we started with we were on objection true. Objection 2. Wow, I can't talk tonight. And so we answered the first part about age, and age having no effect on truth. Whether something was 1 day old or 2,000 years old, truth doesn't change with age. Now, I think I need new glasses. Yeah, I'm going to get an eye exam. Because even with my glasses, the slides are starting to get a little blurry. So, but the basic objection is we don't know who wrote the original Gospels. Now, this objection doesn't go so much against the epistles. For the most part, the Pauline epistles go without objection. There are a couple based on the introductions. Some extreme critics will say this is not Pauline or written by Paul in nature. But for the most part, we can have confidence that Paul wrote all the epistles in the New Testament. And I'm not really going to address those. I want to focus on the Gospels for this portion, because that's what a lot of people look at. And they're just like, we just don't know who the authors were for the Gospels. And so somehow that makes them untrustworthy. Well, again, somebody wrote them, and just because we don't know this person doesn't mean that they're not telling the truth. That's if we didn't know who they are. But what I want to present tonight is what's called an abductive argument. A lot of times when we try to argue, we want to argue for as close to 100% certainty as we can get. Now, sometimes when we reach back 2,000 years, it's kind of hard to get 100% certainty. And so here's the thing that a lot of people don't know. We don't have the originals of the Gospels. They no longer exist. They were lost to time. And so when it comes to technical terms and dealing with ancient manuscripts, we use terms like autograph. And it's actually where our term autograph came from that we use today. The autograph in antiquity, in ancient times, when a person would write their own letter or they would have a scribe write their letter, at the end of it, they would sign it so that you knew who wrote the letter. It's what we do with our letters today or when we sign our emails. And so we would call these originals autographs. We don't usually call them an original. Sometimes we will use original because there is some exceptions in ancient Roman history where a scribe would copy down what the person said, make an exact duplicate, and the person would sign one, making it the autograph. The other one would remain unsigned, being an original. I know it sounds like kind of weird because it's a copy, but since they were both produced by the same scribe, one's the autograph, one's the original, even though they're both originals. Very technical terms when it comes to ancient documents, but for the most part, we call it an autograph because in history, all letters, for the most part, were signed. Now, can I prove that every letter was signed? No, I cannot. But here's the problem with the skeptic. We don't have the originals. So they'll say, we don't have the originals, so we don't know who wrote them. That's an argument from silence. They don't know if they signed them or not. So when they're like, well, for Matthew, we don't have the original, so we don't know if he signed it, so it could be anybody. Well, we don't have the original, so you don't know what you're talking about, because historical evidence favors somebody would have signed it. You have no evidence. So now notice, I can't prove my point, but I have more of a case that somebody would have signed it than not. So I'm already presenting two possibilities, but my possibility has more historical weight. So this is an abductive argument. Now, the other word we're going to use is called extant, which think of existent, right? They sound the same. So an extant copy is a very, very old copy that still exists today. Makes sense. Extant, existent. We do have a lot of extant copies, and they are ascribed to the four authors in the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So that's very interesting that when we start to look back to these copies that we do have that are 1,700 years old, not 2,000, they are attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, again, that doesn't say who the original was, who wrote the original, but it gives more of a case that if it's close to the original, there was probably not, there wasn't enough time for it to change authorship. Too many people would have known who from where it was copied from, what the copy. I'm trying to make sure I use right terms. What copy one, what copy two, when it copied from copy one. If copy one said Matthew and copy two says Matthew, people would have known if somebody added or changed something, if that makes sense. And so, again, I can't prove this all the time, but I can prove that, within 200-300 years of well, really 100 to 200 years of them writing the Gospels, we can go through dates, that they start to add authorship to them. So that's very, very early. So again, I'm starting to build my abductive argument that we have good proof of these authors. Next, what I want to add to is, I am so sorry about my glasses. My dog's chewed my other ones. I'm just going to turn my back here. We possess no known original manuscripts or autographs of the New Testament. I told you about that. And there's no other competitors. There's never been. When we say Matthew is the only known author of the gospel according to Matthew, no one has ever said, well, it could be Barnabas. That's never happened. So again, there's no known competitors, not throughout all of history. The only thing that the critic can say is, well, we don't have the original, so it might not be Matthew. That starts to become a very weak argument. Now, I want to see what the early church had to say, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to turn my back on the camera, but Athanasius, and this is around 367, but he ascribes the authorship. This is an early church father, and these are people that were trained through the apostles. Like, we'll start to see that, like, Polycarp was trained by John, the apostle John, and Polycarp had apostles. So there's direct lineage on our side with history, and Eusebius, the first church historian, he starts to record this stuff. But as you can see from Athanasius, he is ascribing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and even some of the epistles given their authorship. So when we start to go through the quotes of the early church, we see that there was never any doubt as to who wrote these early manuscripts. So now, where the skeptics saying, well, we just don't know who they were, yes, we do, and we actually know the characters of these people. They were tortured and died because they wouldn't recant. That's a good indication of telling the truth. So let's see. When it comes to Matthew, here's the people that attest that Matthew was the author of Matthew. We have plenty of quotes from these people, from Irenaeus, Origen, and Eusebius. And they quote even earlier sources that all attest that Matthew is the original author. When we look at Mark, the authorship was confirmed by the early church father Papias, as recorded by Eusebius. Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that was remembered. And that's Papias quoting presumably the Apostle John. So now we have apostles being quoted, given authorship to other Gospels. And so we kind of start to build this intricate web where, John is affirming that Mark scribed for Peter. Like, this is now starting to become multiple witnesses, right? So it's kind of hard to say that we don't know who wrote the Gospels. And this is a criticism that a lot of skeptics love to throw out. We just don't know who wrote them, so we can't trust them. Well, that statement just doesn't stand. Like, if I found a piece of paper that said, "The sky is blue, signed anonymous," do I not trust that piece of paper? Or can I do investigations? I can walk outside and see that the sky is blue. I don't know who wrote that, but turns out that piece of paper is true. Same thing, even if we didn't know who wrote the gospel according to Luke, we can investigate the claims inside of Luke, which, I forget the British historian, he lived about 100 years ago. He was an atheist architect, and he's quoted as saying that Luke was a first-rate historian. This was a British archaeologist. So we can investigate the claims and actually see that internally their claims match with reality and that they're true. So even if they were anonymous, that claim that we don't know who wrote these, so they're untrustworthy, just doesn't make sense. But we also see that it doesn't make sense because we do know who wrote them. It wasn't until like the last 100 years that skepticism became so big that people after 1900 years went, maybe we don't know who wrote this. Even though for 1900 years we've been going, oh, Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark. Then after 1900 years, somebody went, maybe we don't know. It's kind of weird. But as we come to Luke, all early evidence, including Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, Eusebius, Jerome, states that Luke, the traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, was the author of the 2-volume work of Luke and Acts. When we look at John, Ignatius of Antioch, and notice this is about 110. The Gospel of John is placed about 95 to 105 for its writing. So notice these dates are very close. There's just not enough time for somebody to get in there and change history. For us to do what's called legend creep, and we'll talk about this, takes about 400 to 500 years. So 10 years isn't going to cut it for legend creep, and we'll talk about that. Explicit references to John's authorship in the fourth gospel are found from Theophilus of Antioch from about 180. Irenaeus, and he says that John, the disciple of the Lord, who has also leaned upon his breast, which is quoted out of the gospel, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. What is especially significant about Irenaeus' testimony is that he derived much of what is said from Polycarp, who died in 156. And remember, I told you Polycarp was John's disciple. Notice these are all very early dates, and as I told you, the gospel according to John is dated to have been originally written. Well, I date it to about 95. The earliest dating, some will date it to about 60 AD to be written. I don't think anybody pushes it past about 105. There are some extreme cases where some skeptics that don't believe John wrote it would say that it was written around 170, but the internal and external evidence just completely destroys those arguments. Irenaeus on John, again, you can read this quote right here from Irenaeus and see that John was the author. I'll give you a second to read that one. Okay. So, Dr. Craig Bloomberg, he's a New Testament scholar. He deals in textual reliability quite a bit. If you want to see, he was actually very prominently featured in the Case for Christ. And, let's see. Yeah, so he's actually kind of a late dater. He's going to place Mark in the 70s. I tend to place Mark in the mid-40s. Matthew and Luke in the 80s. I place them in about the 50s. John in the 90s. I tend to agree. And there's ways that we can date all these. Let's see. The New Testament scholar, Documents were written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses who would have served as correctives if these gospels were false. That's the important thing, is no matter the dating. Now, notice he has a later date than I do, which is okay. But notice our dates are all approximately within the same range. If I put Mark at 45 and Matthew and Luke in the 50s, we're talking maybe a 10, 15-year spread right there. His spread is also going to be about, 15 years between all three Gospels. And so that means that if Mark's was completely off and was being circulated, Luke would have said, what is this junk? This is a complete lie. Plus, we had the other 10, 11 apostles running around, plus Paul and James and all these other apostles. There were more than 12, but we have to understand apostle kind of changes its meaning when it comes to the brother of Jesus, James, the leader of the Christian church, and Paul. They're not like the 12 apostles that will sit like Matthias that was added, that will be added to the 12 thrones. So apostle means one that's sent, probably a totally different lesson out there. But anyhow, they all serve to make sure that the truth is coming out because they're under heavy persecution, especially after 63 AD when the Emperor Nero, whose library burned down in Rome, blamed the Christians and said, kill all Christians, right? Like they're under heavy persecution. At this point, they need to be telling the truth. And so they're going to correct each other if there is any issues. Now, Sam Craig, he believes that the Gospels were actually written even earlier than mentioned above, but he typically gives the later dating to try to minimize arguing with more liberal academics, right? Trying to find common ground. Typically, for me, I wouldn't do that. I think there's plenty of evidence for the dates that I gave. And this is why. Paul probably died, I would say 62 to 64. Some people will push it as the end of 65. Acts ends, it's centered, personally I think Acts should be called Acts of the Holy Spirit, not Acts of the Apostles, but that's a whole different tangent. Starting in chapter 9, it really starts to compare Paul with Peter. Peter raised somebody from the dead, Paul raises somebody from the dead. Somebody touches Peter is healed, somebody touches Paul is healed. There's a big parallelism, but starting at chapter 9, it really follows Paul. We have these we passages from Luke. It's Paul, 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 nothing. Doesn't talk about Paul dying. And we know that because of the Roman persecution, that thing with Nero that started in 63, and I think Paul was a little bit ahead of his time and got his head chopped off in 62, that Acts was unfinished. That means that Acts had to be written before at least 64. Let's give it a late date. Let's say Paul died in 64 or 65. Acts has to be written before then. Now, if Acts is part 2 of Luke, well, Luke has to be written even before that, and we have to give time in between, at least a year between each book. So let's say Acts was written in 64, right? Because it ends before Paul's dead. Paul dies in 65, which I think Paul died earlier. So Acts is written in 64. That means we have to give it a year, so Luke has to be written at least by 62. Probably still a little bit earlier. Luke depends heavily on, takes a lot out of Matthew. It's what's called Markian priority. And I know I said Markian, but he's going to use a lot of Matthew. If you read Luke, he uses Mark and Matthew, which means Matthew has to come before Luke, which is going to now place Matthew at least into the late 50s, right? But the development of Matthew, if you compare Matthew to Mark, Matthew's really well developed, and we know that Matthew takes a lot from Mark, but doesn't really seem to take a lot from Luke. So Matthew's highly developed. Mark, it's like 16 chapters. It's kind of like, let's blow through everything that Jesus did while he was here on earth and get to the resurrection, because that's important. That's kind of how Mark reads. Matthew is so much more about, hey, God is here with us. Let's talk about that for a while. Let's start with some genealogies and talk about this, right? So Matthew is so much more involved. It has to be more than a year difference. And so that's why we start to push Mark all the way back into kind of at least the late 40s. There's good evidence for 45 internal to Mark, but you can see how we start to date these things. So just kind of good evidence of dating. Let's see. Craig, on Paul's letters, well, I'm going to kind of... This is important because one of the letters that we know for sure is 1 Corinthians was dated in the winter of 55 AD. And that was to 1 Corinthians. And we're going to hold on to this date because of how some of the people love to go against the Gospels. This is kind of cool. Let's see. Okay, yeah, so Paul begins writing around 45 to 48 between Galatians and Thessalonians. Thessalonians is most likely Paul's first letter, 1 Thessalonians. Galatians comes out there somewhere, which is a really fun letter. And then most of his works in the 50s before, and it's being written about the same time as the Gospels. Remember, I told you there's probably good evidence for Mark and Luke to be written in the 50s to early 60s if we give Paul a late death. Well, 1 Corinthians we know for a fact was in 55. That's one of the few that's not disputed, is this Christian creed, and it's called the Creed of Faith. And does anybody know what 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 3 through 8 says? I guess you didn't know you would get quizzed on verses. Yeah, it's about the resurrection. Paul says, I give you what I received that is of first importance. Notice he says of first importance. So when everybody wants to argue Christian doctrine, here you go. I give you what I had received of first importance, that Christ died according to Scriptures, was buried, and raised on the third day according to Scriptures. That was a creed. So, this creed existed at least in 55 AD. Now, some people love to say that the resurrection was a myth invented by the later was invented by the later church, maybe the Council of Nicaea, Constantine, and they added the resurrection. Okay. Let me recenter on my thoughts here. All right, so a lot of people say that the resurrection was a myth that was added by like Constantine or the later church, and Jesus was just a really good man. But already we can kind of start to see that that's false just by reading the Bible. 55 AD, Paul is saying, I gave to you what I had received. Now notice a couple key words here. I gave to you. That means he already did it before he wrote 1 Corinthians. I gave to you. So when did Paul first establish the Corinthian church? 50 AD. But he said, what I had already received. Okay, so that means he had to receive it before 50 AD. By the way, there is some discrepancy when Christ died on the cross between 30 and 33 AD. So this can throw off our timing by about 3 years. So if Paul received this before 50 AD, is there anywhere we can look? I'm glad you asked. Yes, Galatians, I think it's 1:18, where he says that, he spent like 3 years in the desert learning, right, with Jesus, and then he went to the disciples to confirm his learnings. Well, this happened, and this actually happened probably around 35 AD, and we can actually date that through Galatians, because he says it was 3 years after. Let's see. So there we go. We're at the Creed of Faith. And so he, if Christ dies in 31, he's on the road to Damascus. He spends 3 years in the desert. We're at 34. And then you can backtrack off of Galatians, the 14 years and all this stuff. Turns out that right around 35 AD, he's talking to Caiaphas. And notice it's a very formal name for Peter that he uses in Corinthians. That's why we know it's a creed. and he's talking to some of the leadership about this creed. We have a creed at least 35 AD. Look at that. So when people are like, oh, the resurrection was a late invention added as a myth, actually this resurrection creed seems to be fully established within 5 years of the resurrection, at a bare minimum. Now, I can argue for an earlier date. Most people can even argue it within a year. And bear in mind, it takes time for creeds to develop. So it's one of the really cool things about the authenticity of how the Bible is going to authenticate itself. Notice how people are like, well, we just can't trust it. But as we start to go through the whole Bible, we can look at things and go, okay, well, you don't trust that they believed in the resurrection, which the Gospels talk about. But yet, Paul, that we can firmly date, and you say that nobody was talking about resurrection, so we don't trust the Gospels. Well, it turns out that they were talking about resurrections within 1 to 5 years of Christ dying by creeds. So we actually have very strong evidence for that. Let's see. And so here's kind of another way of looking at the timeline. If the crucifixion happened in 30 AD, Paul's conversion was about 32. Paul went to Damascus where he met Ananias and some other disciples. His first meeting with the apostles in Jerusalem would have been around 35 AD. That's 3 years later, according to Galatians 1:18. At this point, that's where Paul was given this creed of faith found in 1 Corinthians 1:15, 3 through 8, which had to already have been formulated and was used in the early church. Now you have the key facts about Jesus' death for our sins, plus a detailed list of those who he appeared to in resurrected form, all dating back to within 2 to 5 years of the events themselves, all corroborating what the Gospels say. Crazy. And that comes from Corinthians, which is an undisputed Pauline epistle. Even the most critical academics give that Paul wrote Corinthians. Now what we're looking at is just how does the Bible compare to other antique works, right? Like how well can we trust this? So if you work across, like you see, Homer wrote the Iliad. He wrote it about 800 BC. The earliest manuscript that we have found is from 400 BC. So that's like 400 years of a time gap between when it was written to our first extant copy that we have. For a long time, we only had about 600 copies. Now we're up to about 1,700 copies. That's one of the best ancient manuscripts we have to study. That's actually the second best, just so you know. That's why we put it in the top rank, Homer's Iliad. And then we can look at all these other ones. You know, they have like 100 copies, time gaps, just insane time gaps. Now, when we get to the New Testament, we have a time gap of about 40 years. 40, not 400. And we have about 5,800 copies in Greek alone. It blows away any other ancient book. Now, why is this important? Because of forensics. We can put each copy next to each other and see where every scribal change occurred. People don't know that. Like, people are like, did you know the Bible has changed? Yeah, we know. We documented every single change, and I'm going to tell you about them right now. I'm going to tell you why they don't matter, too. So, the New Testament is also in other languages. Here's the early copies we have in other languages. Basically about 20,000 copies. Remember that 5,800 copies in Greek? Yeah, well, we got 20,000 in other languages to compare to also, from scribal, handwritten copies. And we have about 1 million quotes from the early church fathers. Barth Ehrman, who's a agnostic PhD in New Testament literature, he actually even admits that we could reconstruct the entire New Testament just from the quotes from the early church fathers, and we could do it accurately. That's how many quotes we have. And this is important because, again, we can see where every single change happens. So, now, to compare it with Alexander the Great, we all believe that he existed in real history, yeah, no doubts. Okay. The two earliest biographies of Alexander the Great were written by Plutarch and Arrian more than 400 years after Alexander's death in 323 BC. But historians think that these are very trustworthy. Yet there's legendary material about Alexander did develop over time. But this was only centuries after these two writers. And that's what that legend creep I was telling you about. You know, it takes about 400 to 500 years. And then we started to notice that Alexander the Great was 8 feet tall and he was birthed by gods. And, you know, just some big legends creeped into the material. But it takes 400 to 500 years. And we actually learned that from Alexander the Great. Plutarch's is very normal writing. There wasn't a whole lot of legend in there. Yeah, he reads like a normal conquering general. And so we've learned that when it comes to the New Testament, ours at 40 years, there's no way that legend could have creeped in to make Jesus from a man to a God. That's kind of what this shows here. I guess I just kicked back on. So Barth Ehrman, the same guy I was telling you about, says that all these variations. Now, he tends to think that because, I don't know if I showed the number, but I think there's like 138,000 words in the New Testament, and we have close to 300,000 variations. You know, with the sheer number that we have, 1 million quotes from the patriotic fathers, the early church fathers, 20,000 copies in different languages, and 5,800 copies in Greek, we have differences. They're called variations. For example, sometimes they spell John, Jon. Sometimes they spell it John. Does this make a difference? Absolutely not. We're still talking about the Apostle John, and that's clear from the writing. It's just a variation. Now, guess what? If that variation happens between 4 manuscripts, that's 3 variations, and we're going to count it 3 times. And so these add up. Now, they make this claim that because there's like 300,000 variations out of 138,000 words, that the New Testament's not reliable. But guess what? Most of these variations are insignificant. They're mostly punctuation, because believe it or not, Greek does not use commas or periods, or especially Koine Greek, or it's spelling. They're just not viable. They don't change anything. Now, that's about 98 to 99%, depending on which translation you're using. So the Bible that we have today, that NIV sent next to Pastor Ken, actually, knowing what these variations are, we can even tell you, like, we give the scribes weird names, like Scribe 123. We know which scribe changed when and where. And we can see if a scribe made a very strange, like tried to change doctrine, and we can throw that manuscript out. But for the most part, we can see where they're all the same. And that NIV that Pastor Ken has is 99% the same as what the original would have been. And we know this through forensics. The Bible remains unchanged. And in fact, you know, some people will say that we play the telephone game. It's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. This isn't true. The extant manuscripts we use are from like 200 AD, 250 AD. They're very old manuscripts. Codices, really, is what they're called. And we translate those to make our Bibles today. And we verify these against all this data that we have. And we know for a fact that what we're reading is about 99% the same as what the original Bible is. Now, are there some changes out there? Absolutely. I'm going to blow your mind here for a second. John chapter 8, not original. That wasn't supposed to be in the Bible. It's in the footnote. People love to throw that in Christians' face. Did you know John chapter 8 is not supposed to be in the Bible? Yes, it's actually footnoted. If you read it, every Bible pretty much has a footnote saying most manuscripts do not include John chapter 8. It was added about in the 3rd century. But here's the thing. John chapter 8 is about the adulterous woman. Jesus forgave sin. That's the doctrine. If I take out John chapter 8, can I find that Jesus claimed the ability to forgive sin? Sure, the guy that came through Peter's roof. Jesus made a whole lot of Pharisees really mad when he claimed that he could forgive sin. So by adding or taking out John chapter 8, I did not change any doctrine at all. And big theologians study this in detail to make sure that our Bibles are in sync, and they put the full notes in there. So when somebody's like, did you know that John chapter 8? Yeah, Yeah, we've known this for 1,500 years. It's not that big of a shock. We leave it in there because it's been in there and it doesn't change doctrine. And we found good reasons that it could have been part of the original. We can't prove it. Remember that abductive reasoning I was telling you about? There's good arguments that it could have been. Same with the long ending to Mark. And if you read your Bibles, there's a short ending and a long ending. We have abductive arguments to leave those in there. But at the end of the day, any variation or change doesn't change any doctrine. So, I think we're getting about close to time, and I think I've kind of covered everything on our sheets. So with that, I'm going to ask if you have any questions on...
I've been studying John chapter 8 this week. I took my Bible study class and it wasn't in there. Where actually did it come from?
Like I said, it was one of the scribes that they believe added it in the 3rd century. I'd have to look it up again. But there is a lot of abductive reasoning to think that it could have been in some other manuscripts that were even earlier. So the routes of the forensic, how they study it forensically, one route doesn't have it, and another route possibly could have had it. Remember, we don't have the originals, so we have to piece together what we think the originals looked like using forensic technology. And so there's always some questions, and when it's an entire chapter, that becomes really hard. And so a lot of theologians are split on that, whether it was in the original or it was not. But this has been around so long, and everybody's looked at it from every single way that it doesn't contradict any teaching, it doesn't contradict any doctrine, and there is good likelihood that it could have been in the original. So they leave it in there and they footnote it. So it's one of those that we're not entirely convinced that it was in the original, but the abductive logic says it could have been.
And it's a great story.
It really is, and it doesn't undo any doctrine, because at the end of the day, Jesus is saying, I have the ability to forgive sin. And we see that in numerous other stories about Jesus, which is him claiming to be God. So, yeah, and we find that with Jesus many other places, right? With the unclean woman it's the only lady he ever calls daughter. I mean, think about the forgiveness involved in just calling her daughter, where she was unclean for, 7 years? Her whole life? I forget. Yeah, it was a long time. That kind of forgiveness for something that wasn't her fault, and calling her daughter so again, John chapter 8, they don't condemn you, neither do I, go and sin no more, right? Like, we see that Jesus offers for forgiveness, but he also does it in a way of like, hey, don't sin anymore, right? So any lessons that we find in these variants is what we call them, we're going to find them reinforced elsewhere in the Bible. That's also kind of the point of it. And my point as an apologist is never to undermine the authority of the Bible, because I think John chapter 8 survived. My personal stance is I think it survived because of the Holy Spirit. That's my Christian answer. As an apologist, I look at it and I know the history of that chapter, and I know people love to try to surprise people and go, well, if you read the footnote in the Bible, yeah, who do you think put the footnote in? It was Christian theologians. We're aware.
You feel the same on the passage in Mark, at the end of Mark 16?
Yeah, the long ending.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that one, the vox or the voice does kind of change a little bit. I haven't studied the long ending in detail, but again, that one's footnoted as a longer ending. I think it ends, I forget the chapter.
Well, it ends in chapter 16 with verse 8.
Yep, so they have that. There's also other ones. It's like, I think it's in Matthew 22. You'd have to look at it, but like the King James was the first one to get chaptered and numbered, right? And we don't change this. So if we have a new Bible and we remove a verse, because remember I told you, so like the King James uses the Textus Repticus, which is from about 1100 AD, and it's very accurate. It really is. But we now use like the Codice Alexandrinus, Vaticanus, or Senecis, which are from 250 AD. So they're much earlier, so they're closer to the original, so they're more accurate. And so sometimes we see that they don't have things that the King James has. And so we don't put those in the newer Bibles. And you'll look at the verses, and it'll go 20, 22. It just skips 21 altogether. But we keep the numbering the same. And people will be like, look, it's missing a verse. Yeah, you think a theologian with a PhD doesn't know how to count? We do that on purpose because we're not hiding anything from anybody. Now in the KJV, verse 21's there because they use a different manuscript, the Replicus. But since we're using the Vaticanus, it's not in the Vaticanus, and that's a much earlier thing, which means that verse 21 was probably added later. Now again, the King James, does that change any doctrine? Not at all. And so we're not worried about those variants. We've checked every single one of them, and what we can say is the Bible is biblically sound, doctrinally sound, and we have less than 1% of variants that are at all viable. And when we look at them being viable, like they actually matter, like John chapter 8 or Matthew 22, 21, or what, I think that's the verse. Then we look at them and we go, well, they still don't affect anything. And so that's the high confidence that we can have in the textual reliability of the Bible. We know who wrote it. We generally know when they were written. And we know that they're trustworthy because when we check it as like a thread throughout all the books, it always comes back consistent. And that was kind of the thing I wanted to give you tonight. Now, that was like the real high overview, just a couple things. The Creed of Faith found in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8. Beautiful creed, definitely proves the resurrection. Very early, it's a great verse to know. One of the earliest Christian creeds. So I think that that's very valuable to us as Christians to know, just on a faith thing, because if that's what the apostles were teaching as a creed, I think we should know it. That's just me, and it's right there in the Bible. So that's why I wanted to share that with you, but I also wanted to share because that shows very early that the apostles saw Christ resurrected, they believed it, they wrote it down, and the rest of the Bible confirms it, whether it's Galatians, Corinthians, whatever. Cool. Any other questions? Everybody tired and asleep now? I didn't even get into form criticism. All righty. I guess we'll pray.